The smartest person in the room is usually the one nobody notices. The laughter came first. Sharp, confident, effortless. The kind of laughter that belonged to people who had never been told no. It echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Wellington Club, one of Manhattan's most exclusive private dining venues, where billion-dollar deals were often negotiated between courses and sealed before dessert arrived. At the center of the room sat Ethan Blackwell, founder and CEO of Blackwell Capital, a man whose name regularly appeared on business magazine covers and financial news networks. At 38, he had built an empire worth more than $3 billion. People listened when he spoke. Markets reacted when he moved. And tonight, everyone at the long mahogany table was listening to him. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the polished silver of his watch catching the warm light as he reviewed a stack of legal documents recently delivered by a group of European investors. The agreement represented months of negotiations and potentially the largest acquisition of his career. Around him sat attorneys, advisors, analysts, and executives. Every person in the room carried impressive credentials. Every person except one. Claire Bennett moved quietly between the tables carrying a tray of sparkling water. Most guests barely noticed her. That was normal. People rarely noticed waitresses, especially waitresses like Claire. She wore the same black uniform as everyone else. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. No jewelry, no attempt to stand out. Yet there was something unusual about her calmness. While the executives debated figures and legal clauses, Claire seemed strangely attentive to the conversation. Not curious, not intrusive, simply listening. The way someone listens when they understand more than they reveal. Across the table, one of the European investors pointed toward a final page attached to the contract. There is one section our translators struggled to modernize, he admitted. An old reference from the original document. Ethan smirked. How complicated can it be? The investor shrugged. The language is unusual. Several attorneys examined the page. One adjusted his glasses. Another frowned. The room grew quieter. A few Latin words appeared in a paragraph near the bottom of the agreement. Nobody seemed certain of the exact meaning. Ancient Latin, one attorney muttered. That's not exactly something we deal with every day. Ethan laughed. Good thing we're buying a company and not joining the Roman Empire. The room chuckled politely. Claire paused beside a nearby service station. Her eyes drifted toward the document for only a second. Then something changed, almost imperceptibly. A slight narrowing of her gaze. A tiny hesitation, as if she had noticed something no one else had. One of the lawyers sighed. We'll probably need an academic consultant before signing. Ethan waved dismissively. For a single paragraph. He shook his head. I'm sure it's nothing important. Then, without thinking, Claire quietly spoke. Actually, it might be very important. Her voice was soft, barely above conversation level. Yet every word landed with surprising clarity. The room fell silent. Ethan turned toward her. Slowly, amusement already forming in his expression. And what exactly makes you think that? Claire looked at the page again. Her hands remained steady. Her face revealed nothing. Then she spoke 7 words that would change the entire evening. Because that isn't what the Latin says. For a moment, nobody moved. The soft piano music drifting through the dining room suddenly felt distant. Even the servers near the entrance stopped in place. Ethan Blackwell stared at Claire Bennett as though she had spoken a different language herself. Then he laughed again. Not loudly this time. Just enough to remind everyone who controlled the room. And you know this because? He asked. Claire remained calm. Because the phrase they translated as transfer of administrative responsibility does not actually mean that. One of the attorneys frowned and adjusted his glasses. You read Ancient Latin? Claire hesitated. Some of it. Ethan leaned forward. Some of it. The amusement returned to his eyes. That contract is nearly 200 years old. Claire nodded slightly. Yes. And you are telling me that every legal expert involved in this deal missed something? A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. The question sounded ridiculous even to them. Claire looked toward the page. I am saying that one word appears to have been interpreted incorrectly. Silence followed. One word. That was all she had said. One word. Yet something about her confidence unsettled the room. The lead attorney cleared his throat. Which word? Claire stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough to see the document clearly. Her finger hovered above a line near the bottom of the page. Custodia. Several lawyers immediately nodded. Custody, one of them said. Protection. Claire slowly shook her head. Not in this context. Ethan folded his arms. Then what does it mean? Claire studied the sentence for another moment. The answer seemed obvious to her. Almost disappointingly obvious. Liability, she said quietly. The room went still again. One attorney immediately objected. That is impossible. Another opened his laptop. A third began flipping through digital references on his tablet. Claire said nothing further. She simply waited. Across the table, one of the European investors suddenly looked less comfortable than before. Ethan noticed. It was subtle. A tightening of the jaw. A brief glance toward his colleagues. The kind of reaction that experienced negotiators learn to recognize. Ethan's smile faded slightly. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. The attorneys searched reference databases, historical archives, legal dictionaries. Nobody spoke. Finally, the youngest lawyer in the room looked up from his screen. His face had gone pale. She is right. The words landed heavily. Another attorney checked the source. Then another. The same conclusion appeared every time. In contracts of that era, the term did not refer to protection. It referred to responsibility for future losses. Liability. Complete liability. Ethan slowly turned toward the investor who had supplied the agreement. The man offered a strained smile. A historical wording issue, he said. Nothing more. But Ethan no longer seemed interested in explanations. His attention had shifted elsewhere. Back toward Claire, the quiet server standing beside the table. The woman nobody had noticed 30 minutes earlier. Claire lowered her eyes and reached for her tray. As far as she was concerned, her job was finished. Yet as she turned away, Ethan spoke again. This time there was no laughter in his voice. Miss Bennett. Claire stopped. Yes, sir. Ethan stared at her for several seconds. Who exactly are you? Claire could feel every eye in the room following her, yet her expression remained unchanged. The tray rested lightly in her hands as though nothing unusual had happened. Around her, executives worth millions of dollars sat in stunned silence, still processing the fact that a waitress had identified a mistake none of them had seen. Ethan Blackwell stood slowly from his chair. He was not angry. That surprised everyone. Ethan had built a reputation for impatience. People feared disappointing him. Yet now he looked less frustrated than curious. I asked you a question, he said. Who are you? Claire offered a polite smile. I am your server this evening, sir. A few people laughed nervously. Ethan did not. You know that is not what I mean. Claire glanced toward the dining room where other guests were waiting for service. Table 12 still needs dessert menus. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. You just prevented me from signing a contract that could have cost my company hundreds of millions of dollars. I only pointed out a translation issue. Most people could not read a single sentence of that paragraph. Claire lowered her gaze. Most people have different interests. The answer only deepened the mystery. Ethan watched her for another moment before finally nodding. Thank you. The words surprised everyone at the table. Ethan Blackwell was not known for offering gratitude easily. Claire inclined her head politely and walked away. As she disappeared into the flow of the restaurant, conversations slowly returned. Glasses clinked. Silverware touched plates. The evening resumed. But something had changed. Ethan remained standing beside the contract. His attention lingered on the doorway through which Claire had vanished. Across the table, one of his attorneys cleared his throat. We should probably review the entire document again. Ethan nodded without looking away. Review everything. Everything. Every page. The attorney immediately agreed. Meanwhile, Claire entered a service corridor hidden behind the main dining room. The noise faded. The bright light softened. She set down her tray and exhaled quietly. Not dramatically, just enough to release the tension she had been carrying. She already regretted speaking up. For years, she had learned the value of staying unnoticed. Life was simpler that way. Attention created questions. Questions created complications. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Claire. She turned. It was Margaret, the restaurant manager. What happened out there? Claire offered a careful smile. A translation disagreement. Margaret stared at her. Half the executive dining room is talking about you. That will pass. I'm not sure it will. Before Claire could answer, her shift phone vibrated. Table 7 needed coffee. Table 14 wanted another bottle of sparkling water. Normal requests. Ordinary requests. Exactly the kind she preferred. She picked up her tray and returned to the floor. Yet when she stepped back into the dining room, she immediately noticed something unusual. Ethan Blackwell was still watching her. Not with arrogance, not with amusement, with interest. The kind of interest that successful people developed when they encountered a puzzle they could not solve. And for the first time that evening, Claire had the uncomfortable feeling that the contract was no longer the mystery Ethan wanted to understand. The next afternoon, rain drifted across Manhattan in thin silver lines, turning the city outside into a blur of glass and reflections. Claire Bennett arrived 15 minutes early for her shift, hoping for an ordinary evening. The hope disappeared the moment she stepped through the employee entrance. Margaret was waiting for her. "Claire," the manager said, "private dining room again tonight." Claire paused. "The same group." Margaret nodded. They specifically requested the room remain available. Claire already understood what that meant. Ethan Blackwell had not forgotten. She forced a small smile and headed toward the locker room. By 6 o'clock, the Wellington Club was alive with quiet luxury. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath warm lights. Soft piano music floated through the air. Wealth moved through the room in tailored suits and polished shoes. Yet the atmosphere inside the private dining room felt different from the night before. More serious, more focused. Ethan sat at the head of the table, reviewing documents with his legal team. The contract remained open before him. Every page had been examined, every clause reviewed. Across from him sat 3 new guests who had arrived only an hour earlier. They were older than the investors from the previous evening. Reserved, precise. Their accents carried traces of Europe. One of them carefully removed a worn leather portfolio and placed it on the table. Ethan frowned. "What is that?" The man opened the case. Inside rested several aged documents protected by transparent archival sleeves. The paper had yellowed with time. The handwriting looked centuries old. "Original records," the visitor said. "These are copies of the earliest agreements connected to the acquisition." Ethan leaned forward. "How old?" "Nearly 200 years." Even the attorneys seemed impressed. Claire entered quietly with a tray of coffee. She intended to serve the table and leave. Nothing more. Then she noticed the documents. Her attention lingered for half a second longer than normal. The handwriting was unmistakable. Dense, formal, ancient. One of the visitors spoke carefully. "There is a particular appendix attached to the original charter. Several historians have attempted translations over the years." Ethan glanced toward the pages. "And?" The man exchanged a look with his colleagues. "There has never been complete agreement regarding its meaning." A lawyer laughed softly. "Another translation problem?" Nobody returned the smile. The older visitor slowly slid one page across the table. "This text has influenced ownership rights connected to the organization for generations." Ethan studied the document. The symbols looked foreign. Elegant. Difficult. "Latin?" he asked. "Very old Latin," the man replied. "Older than most legal scholars ever encounter." The room fell thoughtful. Claire lowered a coffee cup onto the table. Then she saw a phrase near the center of the page. Her hand froze for an instant. Only an instant, but it was enough. Ethan noticed. His eyes lifted immediately. Across the room, rain tapped softly against the windows. Nobody spoke. Claire set down the final cup and prepared to leave. Then Ethan's voice stopped her. Calm, direct, certain. "Miss Bennett." Claire turned slowly. Ethan pointed toward the ancient document. "Tell me something." His gaze never left hers. "Have you seen writing like that before?" Claire looked at Ethan for several seconds before answering. The room waited with quiet anticipation. Rain continued tapping against the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, creating a steady rhythm beneath the silence. "A few times," she finally said. One of the older European visitors leaned forward immediately. "A few times." His eyebrows lifted. "Young lady, there are fewer than 100 specialists in the world who regularly study documents written in that style." Claire lowered her eyes. "Then I have probably seen fewer examples than they have." A faint smile appeared on the visitor's face. It was not amusement. It was curiosity. Ethan noticed it. He noticed everything. "Especially now. Would you mind taking a closer look?" Ethan asked. Claire glanced toward the dining room beyond the private doors. "I am working." "You are serving this room." "I am serving the entire restaurant." "For 5 minutes." Claire hesitated. She disliked attention. Attention led to questions. Questions led to explanations. Explanations led to the parts of her life she preferred not to revisit. Yet refusing would only create more attention. Slowly, She stepped closer to the table. One of the visitors carefully rotated the document toward her. The page looked fragile. Delicate ink covered the parchment in elegant lines that curved across the surface like flowing ribbons. Claire studied it quietly. No dramatic reaction. No sudden revelation. Just concentration. Ethan watched her face. The attorneys watched her face. Even the investors seemed more interested in Claire than the document itself. Nearly a minute passed. Then another. Finally, Claire pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. This section is being interpreted incorrectly. Several attorneys exchanged glances. One sighed softly. Again, Claire ignored the comment. The translation focuses on property rights. She traced the line gently without touching the page. But the writer is discussing stewardship. Stewardship? Ethan asked. Responsibility, Claire replied. Preservation. The older visitor slowly nodded. Continue. Claire took a breath. The original meaning is not ownership. It is obligation. The room fell silent once more. The visitor opened a notebook. Can you explain why? Claire looked at the symbols again. Because the author uses a grammatical structure common in ecclesiastical texts from that period. One attorney blinked. Another looked openly confused. Ecclesiastical? Claire realized what she had said and immediately regretted it. Ethan noticed. Church documents, she clarified softly. The phrasing was influenced by religious scholars. The visitor's expression changed. Respect appeared where skepticism had existed moments earlier. That interpretation has been debated for decades, he said quietly. Ethan turned toward him. And the man smiled. And she may be correct. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody questioned her credentials. Nobody dismissed her observations. For the first time since Claire entered the room, the balance had shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough for everyone to feel it. Across the table, Ethan studied the quiet waitress standing beside the ancient document. The mystery surrounding the text was beginning to unravel. The mystery surrounding Claire Bennett was only becoming deeper. Claire wished the conversation would end there. She wished she could return to carrying coffee, refilling water glasses, and disappearing into the background where nobody asked questions. But the room had already crossed a line. Curiosity had replaced skepticism, and curiosity was far more persistent. The older visitor carefully closed his notebook. Where did you learn that? He asked. Claire remained still. College. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Ethan immediately noticed. Most colleges do not teach students how to interpret 200-year-old ecclesiastical Latin manuscripts. Claire offered a polite smile. Some do. One of the attorneys leaned forward. Which university? The question lingered in the air. Claire lowered her eyes toward the document. For a moment, she considered giving the shortest possible answer. Then she realized that would only create more speculation. Columbia, she said quietly. Several heads turned. One of the attorneys blinked in surprise. Another looked at her more carefully than before. Ethan said nothing. Yet something shifted behind his eyes. Columbia. The name did not fit the image everyone had built around her. A waitress working evening shifts in a private dining club was not supposed to casually mention one of the country's most respected universities. What was your field of study? Ethan asked. Claire hesitated. Classical languages. Silence. The words seemed almost unreal in the setting. Crystal glasses. Corporate lawyers. Billion-dollar negotiations. And a quiet server discussing classical languages as though she were mentioning a favorite hobby. One of the European visitors smiled. That explains a great deal. Claire did not look pleased by the explanation. If anything, she appeared uncomfortable. Ethan noticed that too. The more questions she answered, the less she seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. Most people would have welcomed it. Most people would have used the opportunity to impress. Claire seemed to be searching for the fastest possible exit. You graduated? Ethan asked. Claire looked toward the dining room again. No, the answer surprised everyone. No, one attorney repeated. Claire shook her head gently. I left before finishing. Nobody spoke for a moment. Ethan studied her face. There was no bitterness there. No regret. Only acceptance. Whatever reason had taken her away from that path, she had already made peace with it. The older visitor folded his hands. That is unfortunate. Claire gave a small shrug. Life changes. The visitor nodded slowly. He understood there was more to the story. Everyone did. Yet nobody pushed further. Not because they lacked curiosity. Because something about Claire made intrusive questions feel inappropriate. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that discouraged pity and discouraged judgment. A soft vibration interrupted the moment. Claire glanced down. Another table needed service. A customer requested assistance. Normal things. Safe things. She almost smiled. "Excuse me," she said. "I should get back to work." Ethan looked at the ancient document, then at Claire, then back at the document again. The mystery of the text had brought her into the conversation. But now another realization was beginning to form. The document was no longer the most interesting thing in the room. As Claire turned and walked toward the dining area, Ethan found himself watching her leave. Not because she had impressed him, not because she had surprised him, because for the first time in years, he had encountered something he could not immediately understand. And Ethan Blackwell had never been good at leaving mysteries unsolved. The evening should have ended there. Most business dinners did. Contracts were reviewed. Decisions were postponed. Guests returned to their hotels. Yet long after several executives had left, the private dining room remained occupied. Rain still traced soft patterns across the windows while the city glowed beyond the glass like a field of distant stars. Ethan sat alone at the table now, surrounded by folders, notes, and copies of translated documents. The ancient appendix remained open before him, not because he still questioned the translation. He did not. 3 independent experts had already confirmed Claire's interpretation. What bothered him was something else entirely. A waitress had noticed what specialists had missed. That fact refused to leave his mind. Across the restaurant, Claire continued her shift as though nothing unusual had happened. She greeted guests, cleared tables, refilled coffee cups, ordinary tasks. Yet she could feel Ethan's attention occasionally drifting toward her. Not constantly, just enough to remind her that the evening had become more complicated than she wanted. Near 9 o'clock, Margaret approached her quietly. "Someone left this for you." Claire looked down. A folded business card rested in her manager's hand. She immediately recognized the name. Ethan Blackwell. Claire sighed softly. "Did he say anything?" Margaret smiled. "Only that he hopes you will call." Claire accepted the card but slipped it into her apron pocket without reading the number. "Thank you." Margaret studied her for a moment. "You know most people would be excited." Claire picked up a tray. "Most people are not me." Meanwhile, inside the private room, Ethan received a message from one of his research analysts. He opened the file expecting little. A simple background review, employment history, education records, standard information. Instead, he found himself sitting forward in his chair. Claire Bennett, age 28, former student of classical philology, academic honors, scholarship recipient, published research contributions as an undergraduate assistant. Ethan frowned. The information raised more questions than answers. Why would someone with that background spend years working in restaurants? The report offered no explanation. It simply stopped, as though an entire chapter of her life had vanished. Ethan looked through the dining room doors again. Claire was helping an elderly couple near the fireplace. She smiled politely at something they said. The smile seemed genuine, warm, yet there was also distance in it. A quiet reserve. The kind people developed after carrying responsibilities they never discussed. Ethan closed the file. For the first time, his curiosity no longer centered on intelligence alone. It centered on sacrifice. People did not walk away from promising futures without a reason. Somewhere inside Claire's story was an answer, and perhaps something more important than an ancient translation. At that moment, Claire reached into her apron pocket while organizing receipts. The business card brushed against her fingertips. She glanced at it briefly before putting it away again. Outside, the rain continued falling over Manhattan. Inside, neither of them realized that the contract had only been the beginning. The real story was still hidden beneath years of silence, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. 3 days passed before Claire finally looked at the business card again. It sat on the small kitchen table in her apartment beside a stack of library books and an unpaid utility bill. Outside her window, morning sunlight spilled across the neighboring buildings while the city slowly woke beneath a pale blue sky. Claire stared at the card for several seconds before turning it over. Ethan's private number remained exactly where she remembered it. Clean, simple, direct. She almost threw it away. Instead, she slipped it into a drawer and left for work. Across Manhattan, Ethan sat inside the glass headquarters of Blackwell Capital reviewing acquisition reports. The city stretched beneath him from the 42nd floor. Numbers filled his screens. Analysts moved between conference rooms. Deals worth millions waited for approval. Yet every so often, his attention drifted back to a waitress who had corrected experts twice her age. His assistant appeared at the office door. The research team found additional information. Ethan looked up. About Claire Bennett? The assistant nodded. Ethan accepted the folder. The report was surprisingly thin. Academic records, scholarship awards, faculty recommendations. Then almost nothing. No graduate degree. No professional appointments. No published work after college. It was as though Claire had stepped away from an extraordinary future and simply disappeared. Ethan frowned. Successful people usually left trails. Promotions, achievements, public recognition. Claire's trail ended abruptly. That bothered him. More importantly, it did not make sense. Later that evening, the Wellington Club was quieter than usual. A charity gala had reserved most of the upper floors, leaving the main dining room calmer than normal. Claire moved between tables carrying coffee and dessert plates, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Around 8 o'clock, Margaret approached her again. You have a visitor. Claire looked up. Her stomach tightened immediately. Ethan Blackwell stood near the entrance. Not in a private dining room. Not surrounded by attorneys or investors. Alone. He wore a dark navy coat and carried no documents. No briefcase. No assistants. Just himself. Claire remained behind the service station for a moment. Ethan noticed her and offered a polite nod. Nothing more. No pressure. No expectation. Eventually she approached. Good evening, Mr. Blackwell. Good evening, Claire. The use of her first name felt surprisingly natural coming from him. Can I help you? Ethan glanced around the restaurant. Actually, I was hoping you could answer a question. Claire almost laughed. Another translation? No, his expression softened slightly. A different mystery. Claire folded her hands in front of her apron. And what mystery is that? Ethan looked directly at her. Why would someone talented enough to impress scholars choose to disappear? For the first time since they met, Claire did not answer immediately. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade around her. Glasses clinked somewhere in the distance. A server walked past carrying menus. Yet Claire remained still. Then a faint smile touched her lips. Not amused. Not offended. Just thoughtful. Sometimes, she said quietly, people do not disappear because they want to. Sometimes life simply asks them to be somewhere else. Claire's answer lingered between them long after the words were spoken. Ethan studied her face, searching for clues hidden behind the calm expression she seemed to wear so naturally. Most people explain themselves when given the opportunity. They defended their choices. They justified their setbacks. Claire did neither. She simply returned to work. A nearby table needed refills. Another requested dessert. Within seconds, she had stepped back into the rhythm of the restaurant as though the conversation had never happened. Ethan remained where he was for a moment before finally returning to his table. Yet her words followed him. Sometimes life simply asks them to be somewhere else. It sounded simple, but the more he thought about it, the less simple it became. The following week brought a series of meetings connected to the acquisition. New documents arrived daily. Historical records were examined. Linguistic consultants submitted reports. More than once, Ethan found references confirming details Claire had identified within minutes. Every expert seemed to reach the same conclusion. Her understanding of the material had been extraordinary. On Thursday afternoon, Ethan attended a conference call with several academic consultants from Europe. Near the end of the discussion, one of the scholars mentioned a name. Professor Harold Whitaker. The name caught Ethan's attention immediately. He remembered seeing it in Claire's academic file. After the meeting ended, curiosity won again. He placed a call. The elderly professor answered on the third ring. Their conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Yet by the end, Ethan sat completely still behind his desk. The professor's voice had carried unmistakable admiration. Claire Bennett had been one of the most gifted students he had ever taught. Not one of the best in a class. One of the best in an entire career that spanned decades. She possessed an unusual talent for understanding ancient texts. More importantly, she had worked harder than anyone around her. Then she disappeared. Not because of failure. Not because of academic problems. She simply left. The professor never learned why. Ethan thanked him and ended the call. Outside his office window, clouds drifted above Manhattan. Inside, a new feeling settled over him. Respect. Genuine respect. Not for what Claire knew. For what she had quietly given up. That evening, the Wellington Club hosted a smaller crowd than usual. Claire was arranging menus near the entrance when she noticed a familiar figure approaching. Ethan again. This time he carried something in his hand. A thin leather folder. He walked toward her with the same calm confidence he brought into boardrooms and negotiations. Claire sighed softly. Mr. Blackwell. Ethan smiled. Good evening, Claire. She glanced at the folder. Another translation? Not exactly. He extended it toward her. Claire hesitated before accepting it. Inside was a copy of an academic journal. Her name appeared near the bottom of the first page. She froze. The article was nearly 10 years old. A piece of research she had helped write as a student. Slowly, she looked up. Ethan's expression remained gentle. You never told me you were published. For the first time since they met, Claire seemed completely caught off guard. Claire stared at the journal for several seconds without speaking. The restaurant around her seemed to fade into the background. The soft music, the conversations, the sound of silverware against porcelain, all of it drifted somewhere distant. Her name remained printed on the page exactly as it had been nearly a decade earlier. Claire Bennett. Beneath it sat a contribution note acknowledging her work on a translation project that had attracted attention from several academic institutions. She had not seen the article in years. Carefully, she closed the folder. Where did you find this? She asked quietly. Ethan rested one hand on the back of a nearby chair. A university archive. Claire looked away. That was a long time ago. Not long enough to erase it. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan noticed something unusual. It was not pride in her expression, not satisfaction. It was sadness. Small, controlled, but unmistakable. You miss it, he said. Claire gave a faint smile. Sometimes. Ethan nodded. Professor Whitaker speaks very highly of you. Her eyes lifted immediately. You spoke with him? Last week. Claire exhaled softly. I have not spoken to him in years. Ethan studied her carefully. He said you were one of the most talented students he ever taught. Claire laughed once under her breath. Not because she disagreed. Because the compliment belonged to a version of herself that felt very far away. Professors tend to remember students more kindly than they deserve. He did not sound like he was exaggerating. Claire glanced toward a nearby table that had just been seated. Duty offered an escape. She almost took it. Yet something about Ethan's expression stopped her. There was no judgment there. No arrogance. Only genuine curiosity. What happened? He asked quietly. The question lingered between them. Claire looked down at the journal again. Her fingers rested lightly against the cover. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm. My father became sick during my final year. Ethan said nothing. Claire appreciated that. Most people rushed to fill silence. Ethan simply listened. The treatments were expensive, she continued. My mother had already passed away. There was no one else. She paused briefly. So I left school. Ethan frowned. You left completely? Claire nodded. At first I thought it would be temporary. Her smile carried no bitterness. Temporary became permanent. The answer landed heavily. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was simple. Ethan had spent his life around people chasing success. Promotions. Recognition. Wealth. Claire had walked away from all of it without announcing her sacrifice to anyone. No speeches. No complaints. No attempts to gain sympathy. She had simply done what needed to be done. Across the room, a guest raised a hand requesting service. Claire glanced over. I should get back to work. Ethan nodded slowly. Of course. She turned to leave, then stopped. Professor Whitaker always said something. Ethan looked up. What? A small smile appeared on her face. Languages survive because someone chooses to preserve them. Ethan watched as she walked away. This time, however, the words stayed with him. Because he suddenly realized the same thing could be said about people. Sometimes the most extraordinary lives were not built by ambition. Sometimes they were shaped by responsibility. 2 weeks later, the acquisition entered its final stage. Executives, attorneys, historians, and consultants gathered inside a conference hall overlooking the Hudson River. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the room with pale, autumn sunlight. Hundreds of pages of revised agreements sat neatly arranged across a polished table nearly 30 feet long. What had begun as a routine acquisition had become something much larger. Every clause had been examined. Every historical reference verified. Every disputed translation challenged. Ethan stood near the windows reviewing the final presentation. The deal was worth billions. Yet his attention kept drifting toward a single empty chair near the back of the room. He checked his watch. The meeting would begin in 10 minutes. One of the European representatives approached him. Our historians have one final question regarding the appendix. Ethan nodded. I expected as much. Several interpretations still remain under discussion. Ethan looked toward the conference entrance. Then there is only one person I trust to settle them. Moments later, the doors opened. Claire Bennett stepped inside. She wore a simple navy blazer borrowed from a friend and carried a worn leather notebook beneath one arm. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged in a room filled with corporate leaders and legal experts. Yet as conversations quieted, more than a few people recognized her immediately. The room seemed to straighten, not because of her position, because of her reputation. Claire paused near the entrance. I'm not sure I should be here. Ethan smiled slightly. You are the reason half of us are here at all. Several people laughed softly. Claire looked uncomfortable with the attention, exactly as Ethan expected. The meeting began. For nearly an hour, specialists discussed historical records and legal language. Then the final appendix appeared on the large presentation screen. A passage remained disputed, not because anyone doubted Claire's abilities, because the wording was unusually complex. One consultant presented his interpretation. Another disagreed. A third offered a compromise. The debate continued. Finally, Ethan turned toward Claire. What do you think? The room fell silent. Claire studied the projected text. The ancient words glowed softly against the screen. She read them once. Then again. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The same expression Ethan remembered from the restaurant. The same expression she wore moments before changing everything. Claire stepped forward. Everyone is translating the sentence separately, she said quietly. But the author intended the paragraph to be read as a single idea. Several scholars exchanged looks. Claire continued. The subject changes here. She pointed toward a small phrase nearly everyone else had overlooked. That changes the meaning of everything that follows. One by one, people reviewed the passage again. Then realization spread across the room. Not dramatic, not sudden, just undeniable. The interpretation was correct. Once again, a historian slowly removed his glasses. Another consultant shook his head in disbelief. Ethan watched the reactions around him. The same experts who had once ignored her observations were now taking notes as she spoke. And for the first time, Claire seemed to notice it too. The room remained quiet long after Claire finished speaking. Nobody rushed to challenge her interpretation. Nobody searched for flaws in her reasoning. Instead, scholars reviewed their notes. Attorneys revisited passages they had already examined. Historians compared references across multiple source documents. And every path seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. Claire was right. Again, sunlight shifted across the conference table as the afternoon moved forward. Outside the windows, ferries crossed the Hudson while traffic flowed through the city below. Inside, a very different kind of movement was taking place. Perceptions were changing. For years, people had looked at Claire and seen a waitress, a server, a background figure moving quietly between tables. Now they were seeing something else. Not because Claire had changed, because they were finally paying attention. One of the senior historians slowly closed his notebook. Miss Bennett, he said, I have spent 32 years studying documents like these. Claire looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. The historian smiled. Today you taught me something. A few people around the table nodded in agreement. Claire lowered her eyes. I only noticed a detail. The historian laughed softly. The difference between experts and everyone else is often a detail. Across the room, Ethan watched the exchange. He remembered the first evening at the Wellington Club. The laughter, the assumptions, the confidence with which people had dismissed her, including him. The memory felt different now, smaller somehow, less impressive than he had once imagined. The final documents were distributed shortly afterward. Revised, corrected, verified. The acquisition could finally move forward without uncertainty. Attorneys prepared signatures. Executives exchanged handshakes. Years of negotiations were reaching their conclusion. Yet before anyone signed, Ethan stood from his chair. The room gradually became quiet. He looked toward Claire, then toward everyone else. Before we finish, he said, there is something I need to say. People stopped gathering papers. Conversations faded. Ethan was not known for speeches. When he spoke without preparation, people listened. He glanced at the ancient documents spread across the table. 3 weeks ago, I believed we had assembled the most qualified experts available. A few people smiled. Others nodded. Ethan continued. Then someone who was not invited to the meeting noticed what none of us could see. His eyes found Claire again. She looked immediately uncomfortable, which only made the moment more genuine. The truth is, Ethan said, this deal would not exist in its current form without her. Silence filled the room. Respectful silence. The kind that cannot be purchased or negotiated. It must be earned. Several executives began applauding. Then more joined them. Historians, attorneys, consultants. One by one, Claire stood frozen. Not because she wanted recognition, because she had never expected it. The applause lasted only a few seconds. Yet for Claire, it felt much longer. Ethan smiled. Not as a CEO, not as the most powerful person in the room, simply as someone acknowledging a truth. And for the first time since they met, Claire did not look away. The applause eventually faded, but something remained behind. Not noise, not celebration. Respect. The kind that settles quietly into a room and changes it forever. Claire stood near the end of the conference table, still holding her notebook. For years, she had worked in places where people looked past her. They saw a uniform, a name tag, a tray in her hands. They rarely saw the person carrying them. Yet now, for the first time in a very long time, she felt seen. Not because of a title, not because of recognition, because of truth. The meeting concluded shortly afterward. Contracts were signed. Handshakes were exchanged. Lawyers packed their files. Historians gathered their notes. One by one, the room emptied. Sunlight stretched across the floor as afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Claire prepared to leave quietly, as she always did. Then Ethan approached her. There was no audience now. No executives. No consultants. Just two people standing beside a table covered with papers and memories. Ethan looked at her for a moment before speaking. I owe you an apology. Claire blinked. For what? Ethan smiled faintly. For the first night. Claire remembered. The laughter. The assumptions. The way he had looked at her before he knew anything about her. Ethan shook his head. I thought I understood people. His voice carried none of the confidence that had once filled boardrooms. Only honesty. Then I met someone who reminded me how much I still had to learn. Claire looked out toward the river beyond the windows. The water reflected the golden light of sunset. Most people make assumptions, she said softly. It is human nature. Maybe. Ethan nodded. But that does not make it right. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan handed her a small envelope. Claire frowned. What is this? An opportunity. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from a university foundation partnered with Blackwell Capital. A scholarship. Full funding. Tuition. Research support. Everything necessary to complete the degree she had left behind years ago. Claire stared at the page. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from surprise. From the weight of a door reopening after she had long ago accepted it was closed. You do not owe me this, she said quietly. Ethan smiled. No, he glanced toward the ancient documents resting on the table. But the world owes itself the chance to hear what you still have to contribute. Claire looked down at the letter again, then back at Ethan. Her eyes glistened slightly, though her smile remained calm. The same quiet smile she had carried through every challenge life placed before her. Outside, the sun continued sinking beyond the city skyline. Inside, something beautiful had come full circle. Not revenge, not victory, something better. Recognition. The kind earned through patience, sacrifice, and dignity. Months later, Claire returned to her studies. She did not become famous overnight. She did not seek attention. She simply continued learning, one page at a time, one language at a time, one step at a time. And perhaps that was the lesson hidden beneath everything that happened. The most remarkable people are often the ones standing quietly in the background, carrying stories nobody thinks to ask about. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one conversation, or one act of understanding to reveal the brilliance that was there all along. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone whose value was overlooked or a quiet strength you have seen in your own life, share your thoughts below. Stories like these endure because people choose to remember them. And sometimes the quietest voices leave the deepest echoes.